Is this working? Good. All right, hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. Hello to everyone who's just joining us for the first day. Hello to everyone online. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel of, well, very distinguished speakers. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Jyoti Fernandez's daughter, so I've got big boots to fill. I have had a very academic career, actually. I studied in Oxford several years ago, now moved to America. And throughout my life, I've been faced with the idea that GM is the solution to so many of the world's problems. And this has been a thing that's been repeated to me by so many well-meaning people, well-meaning scientists and professors who truly believe that it can be just like this silver bullet, bring it around a utopia. And that did not go with everything that I'd personally seen and heard, especially from the Indian side of my family. And so it was a relief for me to have such esteemed people to tell me the realities about GM, and I'm really glad that you guys can also hear from them. Today we've got Jim Goodman from the USA, where GMOs are prevalent, they're just a part of everyday society. We've got Gerald Miles, who lives in Wales. He's been campaigning here and across Europe for a very long time against the introduction of GMOs. We've got Vandana Shiva, who spent her lifetime campaigning against GMOs, more recently moving into a very powerful political position, taking several of the big companies to court. And then we've got Liz O'Neill, who's very educated in the science of GM, and she's been doing a lot of work recently on combating the bill that's now coming to Parliament to try and reintroduce genetic engineering in a new, nice form. So I'd like to start, if you don't mind, by asking Vandana, you've been campaigning against GM your whole life. What led you to start your campaigning career? What did you see GM do?
Well, my work on the GM question began with a meeting in 1987 called The Laws of Life on the new emerging biotechnologies. There was no GMO in the world at that time commercially sold, but the idea of genetic engineering was there, and the corporations said so clearly that the reason we must do genetic engineering is in order to take patents, because our future profits only lie in owning the seed. They didn't use those words. They said intellectual property rights on seed, but a patent is granted for an invention, and I know this much: seed is not invented, seed is modified. Seed can be, an element of a seed can be engineered. And I just decided to start saving seeds on the one hand, but because industry had laid out, it said by the year 2000, we will be 5 companies controlling all food and all health. And whoever has the maximum patents will be among those 5. So who are these 5 who control seed today? People who were the chemical industry, who became the biotech industry, who now control 60% of the seed, and it's only a patent war. The problem is that when you monopolize the seed, your tools will be failing. And I think we'll have time during this process to see the failure of tools, but it doesn't matter. Because with the monopoly, a failing tool is still pushed. And I think it's a triple crisis with genetic engineering. First is that an obsolete paradigm, a reductionist mechanistic paradigm, is being kept alive when we have possibilities to do much better. The second is this genetic engineering is in the hands of the poison cartel. And the third is, because you're working with the wrong science, your claims never bear out. And because of that, there's the aggression against real scientists. And while we meet today, I do want to remember dear Arpad Putsai, whose life was devastated by this industry, Maywan Ho, who did so much work, Brian Goodwin. These were the real scientists who, I did a big conference on beyond reductionist biology so that the movements and campaigners and the scientists could work together. And in a way, that's what we have to do again. I'm so happy Michael Antonou is here. There aren't that many of you these days, Michael. and I think we just need new ways of conversations between the real scientists and the farmers and the people protecting seed and food, because just our alliances are enough. When you think a gang of 4 poison makers are ruling us, we should be outraged.
Yeah, of course. And Jim, you've been in a country, run by these poison makers for a very long time. What can you tell us about the reality of living in a country where GM is just every day? Has it delivered what it promised?
No, and I didn't get started in the GM protest business quite as early as Dr. Shiva did, but the first thing that happened in the U.S. was they were developing recombinant bovine growth hormone. And I had been out of the university a few years, and of course as a university student you embrace technology because it's going to help farmers. But after I moved back to the farm, the reality of the academics and what they're trying to do and the reality of life for farmers became pretty apparent. And we were, at that time, struggling with low milk prices, a surplus of milk, and they wanted to come out with an injectable hormone that would increase milk production and produce even more milk. And I'm saying, well, this is kind of a vicious spiral at the bottom because we're not making enough money now and they want to make it even worse. And then they started developing the GM crops, soya and maize. And it was pretty easy to see that they were engineering a industrial agricultural system where they were developing bigger and bigger farms because the small farms were all going out, and the big farms needed to buy grain, and they needed a monoculture of corn and soy to supply these farms. and the farms needed the big livestock industry to buy their grain. So they just kept building the cycle, and it kept pushing small farmers out. And then there was the safety questions that we had no idea, because we had really no opportunity to try and protest and try and stop this. It was one day it wasn't there, and the next day it was. And I think it was in 1992, USDA declared that genetically modified organisms were substantially equivalent to everything else on the grocery shelves. So you didn't have to worry, because they were the same thing. They didn't need testing, they didn't need labeling. And we fought for labeling on milk, which we got, but we had to put a disclaimer on that milk from cows receiving growth hormone is no different than anything else. A label like that should have been a real warning flag to consumers, and it was to some extent, which I think shows the power of labeling, how important that is. It's everyday life. I mean, you just know that every field of corn and soy that you see is genetically modified. Roughly 94% of the soy, 92% of the corn is GMO. Cotton, wheat, the same thing. And it's just the reality we live with.
So, Gerald, have you been fighting against GM for so long to prevent these kind of things happening? What has driven you throughout your career to keep on campaigning against the same thing?
Yeah, well, I got involved in 2001 when there was a trial being grown in a farm near Mathry, which was not far from me, and some farmers had rung me up because we were organic, that we fear contamination from this crop. And we did an open meeting in the village hall, which we thought a few people would turn up, but it was absolutely swamped. People were outside even trying to get in. So the concern of it was really getting around the area. And it sort of grew from that. I was involved in negotiating with a family that were planting the crop. Because I coached their sons in rugby, I had a sort of insight to associate with them. So I would go to them at least twice a week to give them information of what was happening. The whole campaign took about 6 weeks, which was horrendous. It was snowballing after, well, the media we were getting big attention from the media. We went to London to see Michael Meacher and had a meeting with him. It was supposed to be for half an hour, but lasted an hour and a half. And in 6 weeks, the farmer rang me and he said that I've withdrawn from the trial because he said, I can see the concern, and he said, I thank you for your tenacity to keep on explaining to me what's happening. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't, and I hope we keep still as friends. From there, I got involved with the campaigners all over UK, from Scotland down to Devon. We planned certain actions, like delivering a message to DEFRA, where we pulled crops up in 19 trial plots all over the UK, 19 out of 57, and we bagged it, and we all went in convoy to London and delivered it to the doorstep of DEFRA with a message. Some of us made a statement, 5 of us made a statement, signed it, and put it in an envelope and handed it into DEFRA. If they wanted to take legal proceedings against us, they're welcome to, and they could get us from the contacts we gave, but nothing happened. From there, I was involved in planning of campaign with Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, of tractors and trolleys march to London, where I drove a tractor from my farm up to Birmingham and then down to London. It took me 8 days. I had to stop every 2 hours because the bearings of the tractor were getting too hot. I asked JCB for advice and they said I was nuts. Because they said you're going to lose the bearings on your tractor, you'll have to leave them cool down. So I had to stop for 2 hours, fry an egg on the bearings of the tractor, and then leave it cool for an hour, which was quite an adventure. But we had over 2,000 people marching in London, and that really closed the door to GM crops at that time. But now we're facing gene editing, which is dressed up in another fashion. They're using the same language to promote it. And why are we interfering and trying to change nature when we've just gone through a pandemic of a virus that's been created? Why are we still looking at these? It should be heavily regulated. I'm not against the science, but we don't know enough yet. We're still in an experimental. And really, why do we need to interfere with nature? It's us that are the predators, and it's nature we should look after and respect.
Thank you. So, Liz, you've become involved a little more recently, and you've been working particularly hard to fight this new technology that, as Gerald says, seems to be the same sort of thing, just dressed up a little differently. Could you explain to us whether that is a new form of genetic technology or whether it is the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for context, I run an organisation called GM Freeze, which has been around for longer, but I've come to this work in the last decade, which is quite recent amongst this wondrous company. And I think just need to row back very slightly and make a point about language. So, the word genetic has its own meaning, the word modification has its own meaning. Genes are, of course, modified through natural selection, through, selective breeding. The term, when you put the two together, genetic modification, that is jargon. That has a legal meaning, and it means changing the genes in the lab. It means taking out of nature and making that change in a very different way. And that's really important because those promoting these technologies like to play a lot of games with language. And one of the current games is this term gene editing. So one of the phrases that we use a lot is gene editing is GM with better PR. I have to say, it's outstandingly good PR. Anyone who's ever worked in comms or marketing or PR, you have to admire the skill and also the massive budget that has been put into this greenwashing of genetic technologies, because there's been all sorts of new terms out. There are new developments. There is a technology that is developing, and I guess we also need to be careful about the difference between technology and science. Scientific endeavour is about asking questions and working collaboratively. Technology, in this instance, is about patenting a tool to make things. And, I think we're all very respectful of science, of true scientific endeavour. The application of technology is a different thing. And just to kind of address some of that PR that you will probably have heard around the newer techniques. So we're told that gene editing is more precise than GM. Now, the first thing to consider there is precision is not the same thing as accuracy. A stopped clock is extremely precise, but it's only accurate twice a day. And actually, the word accuracy is itself not entirely correct, because what these new techniques are is more targeted. So the GM developers have a more specific idea of the genetic change that they want to make. Previously, they were just sort of bombarding a new set of DNA towards a cell. Now they have an idea of where they want to make the change. That doesn't mean that's what they've done. It means that's what they're attempting to do. And if we don't have regulation, if we don't have anyone checking their homework, we won't know if that's what's been done. So there's a lot of issues there around what actually is different. What is not different is the organisations behind it. So it's all the same, developers are all very interested. It's still patented, the techniques are patented, and the organisms that are being created are patented. So it's the exact same model. And also a lot of the initial uses have been very similar. There's a lot of, there is the hypothetical potential to do almost anything when you change the genome. That includes what you intend and almost anything that you don't intend. Because, the genome is a very complex thing. It's more like an ecosystem than, this idea that the genome is some sort of code book. It's not like that. It's a very complex ecosystem in itself. So the other thing that is very much the same as GM is the claims made for it. So we know that the vast majority of the first generation GM that we've seen and that is still being produced is weed killer linked, sometimes called herbicide tolerant, but these are the crops that are designed to be grown with a particular weed killer, and the insect killing crops, sometimes called BT crops. Now those are the two that have been successful, but if you go back 25 years, GM technology was going to produce drought-resistant crops, salt-resistant crops, more nutritious crops, crops that could magically, make the tea while you were having a nap, I don't know. But basically all the same claims that were made back in, the very early days of GM are being made again about this new technology. So we need to approach those claims with cynicism.
Thank you. I do want to go back to that claim because it is a thing you hear very often, that well-intentioned people want to produce a crop that can be produced with lower inputs because they've heard the fallout, they've heard of the diseases that have come from high-intensity chemical crops, and they don't want to be a part of that, but they are still interested in GM. So perhaps it's drought tolerance or salt tolerance, perhaps it's engineering nitrogen fixation, so you have less fertilizers. Can I ask all of you whether you think that will ever be a reality? Can it be the case that we can have it all? If I start with Jim.
I don't know. 1,000 years from now, who knows? But in the near future, there is no one growth gene or one salt-tolerant gene. It's the genome is a very complex thing, and at this point in our development, to think that we have the knowledge to precisely or accurately, whichever term they want to use, modify that, no. And from the very beginning with Roundup Ready crops, they told us one spray is all you'll ever need. And this will replace the more dangerous herbicides of 2,4-D and dicamba. And people thought, well, that's a good thing, because at the time we thought Roundup was pretty benign, but we now know it's not. But now that that's failing and we have weed tolerance to Roundup, they're going back to these older, more dangerous herbicides. So what did they really accomplish other than selling tons of genetically modified seeds, tons of pesticide? And in the United States, in any way you measure it, whether it's pounds per acre, amount sold, we're putting on more pesticides than we did before this supposed great revolution started. So I just don't see a lot of hope in this, because I don't think we're smart enough to take this technology on. Sometimes I think we just have to let nature do its thing and work with it rather than fight against it.
Gerald, do you think that this technology could ever replace the traditional farming techniques that you value?
No, definitely not. I think we've got to go back to the system we have at the moment. We really we haven't got a rotation like we should have, and we're really depleting the soil. It's really, we've got to respect back to looking after the soil, looking after the crops. And the crops we should be growing is ancient grains. I grow ancient grains, and they look, yes, the yield isn't so good, but they will grow in low fertile soil. It's the answer to climate change that we're going to endure. They are the ones that are going to feed us. I'm not being old-fashioned, but really advancing science. I was privileged, you could say, to attend a Bayer conference on launching gene editing in Berlin in 2018, and what they were promoting. They could create seeds now that are resistant to disease, that there would be no need for chemicals, that all farming would be organic. And on the other hand, they said this is the new way of warfare, that we can create a disease that can deplete a nation's economy. And look what we've had. We shouldn't play with science. We've got to really go back and establish the soils and change the way we're farming so that the soil gives us, nature has evolved over millions of years. So are we going to jump forward to the future? We'll be wearing spacesuits next.
Vandana, you said that the company has approached this from the very beginning with the intention of building patents out of it and making money. Do you think that we're ever going to come around to a world where we can have new technologies like this just invented for the common good?
No, for the common good, you do things that the common good needs. You don't create a complicated, hugely hazardous system, which can only exist with a monopoly because the falsehoods associated with it would not stay in the commons. You know, the whole, when you were talking, you know, 80s, late 80s, I remember the vice president of the World Bank, David Hopper, said, yeah, you've critiqued the Green Revolution, but now we have these new technologies that will allow us to grow food on the moon, food on the Sahara, food on toxic dumps. They also, with the negotiations of the climate, of the Convention on Biodiversity, tried very hard to avoid biosafety regulation, using exactly the arguments that are being used for gene editing today, that it's natural. And I happened to be not just present at those negotiations, but had a role in writing Article 19.3, which led to the biosafety protocol of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I remember in those negotiations, we would have debates. You know, they'd get up and say, it's natural. You know, everything is getting modified. This is like making yogurt and cheese. And I said, yeah, if it is, then why do you take the patents? Yeah. The proof that it is natural is you won't claim it's your invention. I called it ontological schizophrenia. That when it comes to safety, you say it's natural. When it comes to ownership, you say it's novel. You can't hold both. And the same is true for gene editing. I have a book on the resurgence table, which is called Oneness versus 1%. And I've written the chapter on gene editing at the time where Bill Gates was building it up. He was the Rockefeller of our times. If the Rockefellers created genetic reductionism as part of a eugenics experiment, he financed the two scientists in Cambridge and Berkeley. He financed their patent claims, and he has a company called Editas. So this system has no place, you know. When you ask, do you think it can exist in non-patented form? I don't think these exaggerated false claims can exist with the transparency of democracy and independent science. And one of the key indicators, I think the two things are, they say it will reduce pesticide use. The independent research shows the pesticide use is going up. In India, 13-fold more pesticide use in the BT cotton area. But you go to Google University, all the papers that show up are, it has reduced chemical use, it has reduced chemical use. The impact on farmers, prices go up, it's a non-renewable seed, and it's an unreliable seed. And the one issue, you know, for me that became, I didn't expect it, that farmers would commit suicide. So I did a pilgrimage to understand why were farmers committing suicide. Went through the areas where the suicides were. It happened to be the cotton areas, which are 95% BT cotton. Of the 400,000 suicides, between 82 to 85% are in the cotton areas, which is a monopoly now. And even yesterday, because I'm here, you know, no matter where I go, the poison cartel gets me in trouble. And how can they call? And they put this graph of a flat suicide and the growth of the BT. And say, no, she lies. The problem is, when it's 1.4 billion people, 400,000 is still a little dip. And it'll get flattened out as a curve. But the pace to look at is, where are the suicides? The suicides are in the cotton belt. I'll just give you some figure. 2001, with Vidarbha, which is the heart of the BT cotton, and suicides, it was 52 suicides. 2006, 1448. 2015, 1541. So I think the fact that it's a monopoly means that they get away with lies. And that's why we need a very, very broad discussion on this, beyond the lies and the fact that they can own the media, they can own the science journals, they can literally own everything. And I don't think this, this technology, driven by the people who've shaped it, it's driven for selling more chemicals. Herbicide resistance means sell more chemicals. It doesn't work. It creates super pests and super weeds. So, and on the issue of climate tolerance and drought tolerance, I've done a book on climate resilient GMOs, but the genetic engineering is not a climate resilience, which is a multi-genetic trade, as you said, Jim. The genetic engineering is actually a genomic digital reading. And that the algorithms are doing for you now. So you get seed of the Indian peasants that's salt tolerant, you know it's salt tolerant, then you do guesswork about which part of the genome is leading to that trait. So it's literally playing casino, and then claiming you've invented 1,500 climate resilient patents in the hands of the same companies. They're doing nothing, they're just stealing, it's biopiracy. So I don't think, now that I've been looking at this since 1987, and since the commercialization of 1992, on the real impact in real farmers' fields, real farmers' lives, I do think a real farming movement needs to be GMO-free, and free of the propaganda that goes with it.
Thanks. So, Liz, you've been more involved in the discussion recently. Has the UK government been opening up a discussion properly with farmers and consumers, all of the stakeholders involved? Who would you say are the main players involved in that? Is it the same monopolies coming back to us again?
I would sort of say yes and no, in that I think this is where the UK is perhaps slightly in a different position to a lot of the rest of the world, in that absolutely, when you follow the money, when you go up the chain, it is the same corporations. It's the same narrative about corporate control. What is a bit different in the UK, and what is a huge part of the way the story is told in the UK, is the academic expertise. And undoubtedly the UK has a very disproportionately high level of academic expertise in genomics across the board, some of whom are in the room. Now, there are many different ways of interpreting kind of what happens in academia, how it's controlled. Certainly the filing of patents is something that many academics are strongly encouraged to do. But to kind of come at it from the most human perspective, through doing this work, I've sort of been on lots of panels and debates and things with people, and met many of those who are in the academic institutions in the UK who are putting out GM crops to trial. And actually the overwhelming sense that I get from those who are willing to talk to me, which is obviously a subset, is that these are people who feel they are doing a good thing. They are holding that story that Ella, had experienced, and that came to her as wanting to do good. Where it's gone wrong is that these are people who were very good at science at school, and so they went and they did a degree, and they were very good at that, so they did a master's, and then they did a PhD, and their worldview has got narrower and narrower and narrower, because that's the way our academic system works. And so even if these individuals are good-hearted, people of good intent, what they are doing is looking at problems in the world and asking, how can I use my very special cleverness with genes to try and fix this problem? Now that's a stupid question. What you have to ask is, what caused this problem? What's gone wrong and how do we fix it? And what has gone wrong is not the genes. One of the areas that's getting a lot of development in the UK is trying to address issues of yield by improving photosynthesis. And the narrative that goes around that is usually that it's, that there are millions of people hungry, starving, malnourished in the world. Now, nobody is hungry because photosynthesis isn't good enough. Nature did a pretty good job with photosynthesis. People are hungry because they're poor. People are hungry because the food that we have is not distributed equally. And so, there are problems, there are huge systemic problems with knowledge and how actually gaining knowledge narrows people's perspectives and the academic system behind that. There's also a lot of problems with the way the money goes, because these are also academics who want to carry on using their very big brains for the rest of their careers, and they have to get grants. They have to get funding, and that's where the patents come in again. So I think it can be quite challenging to meet somebody who I think they have some motivation that is pure. It's not that this is a bunch of evil people that are all meeting behind closed doors, but they're not addressing the system. They're working within that system, and they need to be breaking out of it.
Thank you. So I guess the big question I have for all of you now is, what is the alternative? If it's not that people are hungry because we aren't producing enough, then what do you think we should do? And I know that's a big question. I know that's what this whole conference is about. But let's go to Jim first. What are you working on in America? What are you pushing for to try and make it a better, more wholesome place?
Well, I agree with the rest of the panel that GM doesn't really deserve a place in our future in the food system. And if we think about the amount of money that's been spent on research, development of GM for the sole benefit of the companies that own it, how much better that research money could have been used. Because any organic farmer will agree we need more organic research, but the money's not there. As the dean of the University of Wisconsin told me once, he said, there's a limited amount of research money, and we get research money and we put it in places that pay. And organic agriculture does not pay. So I think we need to refocus our research priorities and go back to some of the old, like Gerald says, some of the ancient grains. I think we need to redevelop crop rotations because, as I said here 20 years ago, corn and soybeans year after year is not a crop rotation. I think we need to get rid of the CAFOs that we have, the large animal factories, and get animals back on the land. Change our diets so we're eating less animal products. And I think we need research money to do that. And I think that the responsibility of the government should be to fund that research instead of funding GM research and then giving the patents, giving the profits away to the companies that are benefiting from them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Gerald, what could you do with that sort of research money? What should we be focusing on?
Well, so far it's proved that it isn't yielding any benefit. I think the money should be, we need more farmers, we need more young farmers, and we should really make opportunities to fund young people to come back to the land and to farm and grow. And ideally create smaller farms and really populate the countryside to grow more food with young people, to give them an occupation to come back to the land. And really it would benefit us all, because they have grown up in an era of looking after nature. We as farmers, well, I'm in my 70s, we've gone through the whole mill and changing our ways, and we need young blood. Invest in young blood to feed the world.
Thanks. As a young farmer, I support that message. I'll quickly go to Liz then. What should we be asking for from the government? What should we be fighting against with this bill?
Well, so the genetic technology bill is going through the UK Parliament at the moment, and is at quite an advanced stage. So I'll sort of can get into that in a moment. Just to sort of explain a bit about what the bill is. It's based on this concept of what could have occurred rather than what has occurred. So the framing of the bill is that if a genetic change made in the laboratory, patentable, could have occurred naturally. So if there is a hypothetical judgment that this could have occurred in another way that is not considered GM, then it won't be GM. And I mean, that to me just blows my mind. It's an extraordinary way to make law. And, you know, to some extent what we call it doesn't matter in the slightest. But what the bill will do is take away all of the regulatory safeguards that come with that GM label. So independent safety checks, traceability, a requirement for some level of coexistence, so measures to protect other farmers from contamination and to prevent contamination through the supply chain, and also lack of labelling. So we won't know where these are in our food. The bill doesn't just cover plants, all of that also applies to animals. And I should say that all of this comes despite the fact that in 2021 the government ran a consultation on this very concept, this, you know, shall we regulate things differently if they are GM, but they maybe could have not been in some hypothetical, you know, potential future. I think there were over 6,000 responses to that consultation, which is a lot because it wasn't an easy thing to navigate. 88% of the public responses and 65% of the business responses said, no, do not do that thing. They just gave a fundamental no and then more detailed no's on lots of the questions. But the government's doing it anyway. And one of your questions earlier, Ellie, was about the whole, you know, who are the government talking to? One of the things that happened with that consultation is that a huge amount of privilege was extended to the academics who responded. And the academics who responded were those who are engaged in this work, those who are filing patents, those who are getting funding for their work to carry this on. So they are not neutral commentators. And they were also very, very small in number. So that's the bill that's going through at the moment. Do you want me to go into a bit more detail now? Shall I?
I think we'll have time to come back to that.
Excellent. I could talk about it for a long time, so you do need to just stop me.
I more wanted to ask Vandana now. It seems like we've just been catapulted onto the front line of this battle against GM when for so long the UK, as part of Europe, has been protected. How do you see the global battle going? Has there been a shift in public opinion lately? Has there been a shift in the corporations? Have they been forced to take accountability for their actions? Or do we still have a long way to go?
You know, I think both Jill and Gerald showed how actually even in the UK, you weren't safe. It took people's engagement. I was there when you did the tractor march. You know, Michael Meacher was at that march. And I think the difference between the first round of aggression, it was the late 90s. I think 98 was the key period. They went after Percy Spicer, they went after Arpad Putsai, and And we were able to see it in all interconnectedness and organize in our diversity. I think the difference is that the whole science establishment has been totally captured. Not only because the money, by those good scientists, it's not just the patent alone, you're financing. My book on biopiracy has shown, once the Rockefeller defined this field, all the Nobel Prizes went to the reductionist part. It's not that once you look at genes, you will only look at it in reductionist ways. We've got Michael in front of us as a leading molecular biologist, who has been the one who constantly gives us the scientific guidance of what's actually happening. But those voices get silenced within the science system. And they will not be the ones called. You had a prime minister who said, got to liberate the GMO, which means deregulate the GMOs. And it begins with the substantial equivalence of deregulation that began with the use. I remember this so clearly. President Bush Sr. refused to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity, went back and told his vice president, Mr. Quayle, I think his name was, who couldn't spell the word potato. And he spelled the word substantial equivalence. And said, just don't look, don't see, don't find. And call that science, call ignorance science. So I think across the world, the aggression of the biotech industry, which is the chemical industry, is very, very intense. And the silencing of scientists and the silencing of activists. My colleague Aruna, with whom I do this work at home, she's been evicted from her house. I don't have a home, I share home with wherever I am, I'm nomadic in that way. But we know that to get the truth about these issues, you really have to seek out. You have to seek out the experienced people who've been through all the generations. But more important than that, we have to seek out the scientists. We have to seek out new creative alliance building for this time, 2023, of what will topple this bulldozer of lies and the destruction of democracy.
Thank you. So we've saved a lot of time for questions because I've heard people here who want to ask all of you questions from, more about the situation in America to more about the ancient grains. So let's open it up to the audience. We'll try and get as many of you in as we can. Back there.
How can we make this front page news? This affects all sexes, all races, everybody on the planet. How can we make it front page news as a community of scientists, people, farmers?
Gerald, let's ask you that one.
A good question. Capture the media and everything. It's the point we're at now. Yes, we beat the GM crops in the country and we got them out, but now genetic engineering is here. We've got to rewind and start again. But if we all take part and really campaign against this, work together, we can do this. To capture media, always we're back in 2001 and so on. That's why we did actions to create media. It wasn't although I've had policemen, the anti-terrorist detectives visit my farm, we are not terrorists, we're just protecting the planet. At the time when they arrived on my farm, I just took them into my kitchen and gave them my wife's cake and a cup of tea and explained exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. It isn't being Luddites, it isn't being against science, it's against the control of science. And we've got a hard job against us. But we'll all, if we need, we've forgotten. We've got to restart and educate what it really means and what it means to our food. And we can do it all together. We can do it in fun. Always do it in fun, because it's so serious, it'll drive you, well, into breakdown. I'm lucky enough to be a farmer, and I can go back to my farm, and I'm in heaven, and I can replenish myself. But that's what makes me fight this. It's control of our food system. And nature is in control of our food system.
Vandana, what do you think has had the biggest effect when you've been campaigning? What's made the biggest splash?
Well, you know, I've not lived a life wanting to be on the front page of newspapers for the simple reason they can take you off the front page of newspapers very quickly. You know, I used to have columns in the major newspapers of India. I used to have a column in your Guardian. And as the truth starts getting told, the newspapers are threatened, the TV stations are threatened, and you can have the most creative actions and do the best research. You know, we've done research on the BT cotton impact on soils, and they say there's no substantial equivalence, means no impact. 44% destruction of beneficial organisms, 50% destruction of fungi, which increase the photosynthesis capacity of the plant without genetic engineering. So I don't think at this point, where, you know, as long as Mr. Gates is running the Guardian and the BBC, you're not going to be on the front page. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. As long as your community building and your movement building gets stronger. That's what matters. We wrote a book in those early days, 1,000 Ways to Say No. 1,000 ways the actions we're creating, you know, amazing actions. We just need to become far more creative in our movement building and far deeper in our alliance building. And I think now, because as you mentioned, they fought labeling even then, and America still doesn't have labeling, but most of the countries do have GMO labeling. The minute you allow gene editing to be deregulated, you aren't just giving up biosafety, which is an obligation under the biosafety protocol, you are giving up the obligation to inform consumers and the right to know. So I do feel that we need a much deeper connection between the consumer movement and the right to know and the farming movement, both, as well as, of course, the totalitarian control over our knowledge, our seed, our food.
So, Jim, consumer opinion is changing slightly in the US. I know organic is on the rise. What do you think has been getting through? Do you think it's media coverage, or do you think it's something else?
I think that the media is doing a better job, at least some media. We still have a very corporate-controlled media. We have a kind of a right-wing and a left-wing media, and of course the left-wing, more of the populist people, are doing a better job. But I think the pandemic made people start to think a little bit more about their food. There were a lot of concerns where it was coming from, who was growing it. People started making an active effort to connect with a farmer and buy direct. They didn't feel safe growing in grocery stores, for one thing, but I think that it gave them the time to think about what they actually should be eating, where it should be coming from. And everyone, and I know a lot of people that are direct marketers, CSA members, and their sales all went up during the pandemic. So a blessing in disguise, maybe. I just think overall people are becoming more aware. They're looking for better choices, and when people start shifting buying patterns, especially in a country as big as the United States, the media tends to notice. And the people that make a profit off of food want to get in on that game.
So, Liz, what do you think we should be asking for here? What should we be trying to put on the front page of the newspapers? Should we ask about labeling? Should we talk about the funding that's being directed to this when we're in a country that's going through such a cost of living crisis? What do you think will make the news?
I think absolutely we have to demand labelling very, very loudly, and there's enormous evidence that the public wants labelling. In fact, the government has even changed their angle on this slightly. In the last debate in the House of Lords, the answer wasn't, well, we're not sure whether people want labelling. It was, well, yes, we know that all the surveys say that they want labelling, but if you ask people, they'll tell you they want everything. And of course, the key thing here is this is labelling that we have, that is being taken away from us. So I think we have to be very, very clear in that demand. But to return to the questioner's real point, how do we get on the front page? The thing that has been on the front page recently was the RSPB talking about an attack on nature. And I think to this community in this room, that's a really interesting point, because I suspect that I'm not remotely alone in having already thought of the RSPB as actually quite a radical organisation with really strong policies around farming and as a real defender of nature. But the public didn't think that. The media didn't think that. They thought there were a bunch of, bird watchers sitting in hives. And so actually, when organisations that have an image and have a voice really make some noise, that's what's going to make the difference. Gerald's going to have to do something really spectacular to be in the news, because it's not news that Gerald doesn't like GM. It's not news that any of us don't like it. We had a workshop yesterday about GM campaigning, and we had a fun little role play with the highly fictional Penny Hassett WI. But the Women's Institute, speaking up against GM in the first round, that was news. That's what's news. So what I would urge everyone in the room to do is think of all the hats you wear, think of all the systems you're part of, all the organisations you're part of, and talk to them, get them involved. And I'm also, my good friend Claire Robinson, who runs the fantastic GM Watch, has my proper, real old school sheet of paper that you can sign up to join our email list. There are other organisations here who join up. She's going to pass that around, get your pen, sign up, get engaged and get involved, but use those surprising voices, encourage those surprising voices, and don't be afraid to just say no. Everybody at this conference is engaged to some extent with the alternatives, and building an alternative is absolutely a huge part of addressing GM and addressing other negatives. But we're also allowed to just say no. As Vandana says, just say no. 1,000 ways to say no. It's okay to say no. You don't have to understand every bit of the technology. If you know this is wrong, you have to say so, and say so in all the forums that you have.
Thank you. I think that's very good advice. As Ollie said at the beginning, yes. This is all about making connections, and we hope that everyone will take that forwards in all of the realms of work you do. Let's have a question from online.
Hi, great. This is a question from our online audience, from Helena Poole, who's a long-term activist with GM Freeze, and it's about the differences between the challenges for activists now and
get your mic closer.
Back in 2001. So Helena writes, how can we get people engaged in fighting the new push for gene editing in the UK now? It seems much more difficult than it was in 2001.
All right, so a question about the differences between then and now. Let's go to Vandana first. Since you've been fighting for so long, what's changed?
I think what's changed on the one hand is the capture of institutions and the erosion of democracies, much more vicious. But on the other hand, emergence of emergencies that can allow us to connect what the risks are. And Gerald mentioned it. We've been through 2 years of lockdown. And I think it's time for the health movement, the food movement, and the links are so intimate. That's where I think our breakthroughs will happen, where people's knowledge of their health, their immunity coming from food, from rich soil, and that's where seed sovereignty and food sovereignty start to become key political responses in spite of democratic closure, that we can open up our democratic spaces through food democracy. And that's where this GM debate comes into the picture. So what's new is we have so much more evidence of failure, we have so much more convergences of hazards and destruction, and we have so much more convergence of power. Surely it is time to wake up.
Jim, do you think that the pandemic changed much?
I think it did. And like I say, I think people were thinking more about where their food came from. As far as where we are now with GM as opposed to in 2000, I think in a way we are in a more difficult place, because with gene editing, they say it's not genetic modification, which it is. I think the European Union said it is genetic modification. The US, of course, says, oh no, it's fine. The people that are promoting genetic editing in the US want to get it all regulated by USDA because they're a much more lenient regulatory body than the Food and Drug Administration. They are trying to put a nice label on it, like they did with bovine growth hormone. They said, well, it's really appropriately called bovine somatotropin, which sounds better than growth hormone. And I think they're doing the same kind of thing with gene editing and saying it's more precise. So in a way, they're condemning their previous science by saying this one is better because this one is precise, implying the old one wasn't, which of course it wasn't. And they're saying, well, we're really not changing anything because we're just doing what nature could do itself. We're not adding genes, which is, no, nature doesn't do gene editing the way they're doing it. And there is no precision. So in that sense, we are in a worse place, but I think people are more knowledgeable about the science now. They're more concerned about, for example, gene drives, where they're editing mosquitoes to be sterile and releasing them into the wild, and say, because no one cares about mosquitoes, if we kill them all, it'll be a good thing. But birds like mosquitoes, other insects like mosquitoes, pollination can be ruined by these gene drives that they have no idea. And I think people are more concerned about that because it's affecting every part of, it could affect every part of their life, affect nature in a way that, you know, with the original GM, it was a nuisance to farmers that didn't want it. It was a danger to people's health, but this could be a real danger to nature itself. We don't know. And I think people are becoming aware of that.
Mm-hmm. I've certainly noticed that the average level of knowledge about GM seems to have gone up. Do you two want to add anything to that question? Yeah.
Just looking at what's changed, and I should point out very clearly for the record, GM Freeze is a politically neutral organisation, but the government. In the UK, what's different is this government and this governmental approach. And one of the key issues with the genetic technology bill is that it's indicative of an incredibly arrogant approach to both legislation, so the process of making law, and regulation, the kinds of law that it's going to make. It's the first of a series of extremely permissive laws that are coming in that are, you know, taking away individual people's rights, giving more rights to the corporations, and, you know, a strongly deregulatory agenda that absolutely does not have the support of the public at all, even those who are voting for this government. So I think the question was kind of getting at why is it so much harder to get people to engage with GM these days, and I think one of the reasons is that it's part, certainly in the UK, it's part of a much broader attack. And so the answer, I think, is to realise that and to see GM as, you know, an example, as not so much, you know, the individual hill to die on, but the hill that shows where we're going. So my metaphors are completely mixed. It's too early in the morning. But, you know, it's indicative of the approach. And if we lose this, we will lose more. And again, that would, you know, I would come back to, we have to get more of the civil society organisations to engage with this, because they're not going to have the other battles if we lose this one. You know, we've really got to show that the public and civil society will not put up with having our rights taken away from us in this way.
Thank you. Gerald?
Well, to me, I'm looking at the positive. Number one, we're on stage here talking about it to you, and you're listening to us. You can mark this as the beginning of the next revolution, and we can all work together and make this happen.
All right, this side, second row back.
Hi. I think we've got an obsession about having to feed the world, and that's the most common question that makes you go, ugh. It's because it's like, oh, you have to feed the world, so anything you want to do is okay suddenly. You know, it's okay, we can do this because we have to feed the world. But the truth is that we're not feeding the world anyway. There's so much waste. All of the food lacks nutrition, so you can't say that you're not feeding good food. It's also, the big ag is incapable of producing healthy food, so that's where our entire unhealth epidemic is coming from. So if you can only just sort of track back, there was a regenerative farmer that said, I don't have to feed the world, I just have to feed my locality. And we go back to resilience. And the things that we need for resilience, you cannot get from intensive farming. You need to do it locally, and you need to do it in tune with nature. And all of those things, the drought, the salt, the pest disease, all of those things that GM wants to conquer, don't happen when you farm in tune with nature. John Kempf is a really good resource. He's proving that the more unhealthy the plant is, the worse the pest disease. And they can measure that with bricks and the sugar content. So you can measure the health of the plant. And if you've got a healthy plant, it's incapable of attracting the pests and diseases. So you don't need all of those pests and diseases. And I wanted to say that a planetary scale release of biocides, is that not geoengineering and against international law? I just thought if that's a thing that we can go for. And science is, I don't think it's not reliable, because nature has a rescue package and it's free, so you can't monetize it. That's why we're struggling to make incomes from regenerative farming and organic. And because you can't monetize it, you won't get anybody to prove that stuff. And at the Climate Change Committee talk yesterday, they were saying, we need more proof. You just need more science, you need to prove it. But we don't. I said, first do no harm. And if you can, you're talking about the common good. If we were working towards a common good and not corporate profits, then this would all come out in the wash.
Mm-hmm. So a very good point there about how it's not just amount of food, and that's something I've had to address several times in academia, because there's this claim out there that we have to double food production by 2050. At the very base of it, that claim is just numerically incorrect, but as you mentioned, we're not addressing nutrition at all. Jim, can you tell us anything about that, living in a country where food poverty is as widespread as it is?
How much time do you have? Yeah, your point about feeding the world, that seems to be a very particular part of American exceptionalism, that we have somehow decided that we need to feed the world, which is so arrogant, because what gives us the right to tell the rest of the world what they should eat, what they should grow, what is culturally appropriate for them? And furthermore, the world taught us how to farm. I mean, we're a very young nation. We learned so much from the indigenous of the North and South America, and from immigrants, from blacks that were brought as slaves. So the hubris that we have in assuming that someone wants us to feed the world, that we can give them what they want, and that we're able to do that, is ridiculous at best. Do we want to give the world the diet that we eat? That's not a good idea. But that's, you hear that from the corporations that are selling things to farmers, to academics, to government people, that we have to feed the world. And I'm sorry, but the world does not want to eat a lot of confinement-raised beef and confinement-raised dairy and confinement-raised poultry that has to be washed in chlorine to kill the bacteria on it. But that's what our country has to offer, and more than just offer, we intend to force it on the world. And that's just totally wrong.
Vandana, you've been involved in a fight against things like genetically fortified plants such as golden rice. Why do you think that these are so problematic? Why do you think that they are not the answer?
Well, because we have so much diversity, which produces so much more vitamin A and so much more iron and so much more all the pretend increases that all the genetic engineering routes do. I remember when I did the work, I wrote a paper called The Blind Approach to Blindness Prevention, with a table of all the nutrition content in the biodiversity available. Said all we need is more gardens with biodiversity everywhere. And you won't have iron deficiency, and you won't have vitamin A deficiency. And instead of having a sloppy application, which doesn't even, first it's only 300 micrograms, I think, of vitamin A. But it doesn't stay because it's artificially put in there. And so you have to vacuum package it and distribute it fast before the vitamin A disappears. And 80 patents related to vitamin A golden rice. I wrote a book called Who Really Feeds the World, because that was the theme of the Milan Expo. And the industrial system and globalized system creates commodities. It doesn't feed anybody. It's taking food away from people. 90% of the corn and soya is going for animal feed and biofuel. It's not food. And why is the Amazon being invaded, and celebrate Marina Silva being the environment minister again? Hopefully she'll stop this invasion. Or Argentina losing its prairies and all of its forests for GM soya. Why? Because Monsanto needs to sell its Roundup and needs patent returns and royalty returns. That's the driving force. Most of the world doesn't eat soya anyway, except that it used to be an Eastern diet. So factually it's wrong. Yesterday I talked about the love letter from the poison cartel to farmers, you know. They've written in Financial Times a promoted article, love letter to farmers. And they call it a perma-crisis. Not a permafrost crisis. They're talking about perma-crisis. Permanent crisis. Because they have to create permanent crisis to stay relevant. And I think we have, from the practice of the people here, the practice of farmers all over the world, we grow more food, the more we have biodiversity. We grow more food, the more healthy the soil is. You know, we've done reports on health per acre, wealth per acre that show that the best way to feed community is to take care of the soil. And the rest happens. And building local living economies is both, in my view, the solution to malnutrition, the collapse of immunity, the chronic diseases, climate change, biodiversity erosion, but is actually the creative no to the gene editing trick. Because if gardens are everywhere and local farms are feeding people, they can keep saying it's natural, it's natural, it's natural. And there'll be no place for them. There'll be no role for them.
Thank you. Say anything?
Yeah, I think just to add really that this crisis narrative is absolutely essential to the story that upholds the GM promoters. Do you know, this idea that concern for nature, concern for biodiversity is all very well, but don't you know there's a crisis? You have to look at that, you have to call that out, and and you know, be alert for it, because I'm sure it's operational in many other parts of life as well. But also, I think, you know, as it's come up, for me, you know, the golden rice story is incredibly simple. And it takes me back to what I was saying earlier about scientists kind of not asking what the problem is. Now, the problem is not that rice isn't a good source of vitamin A. The problem is that people are living on rice. I mean, nobody should live on one foodstuff. Yes, there are staple foodstuffs, but it's lack of access to a diverse and culturally appropriate diet that is the problem. So, you know, I end up sounding a little bit of a stuck record, but you have to go back to actually asking what's the real problem. And it certainly isn't the genes. You know, there's nothing wrong with the genes of rice.
Thanks. And Gerald, I know you've got a session talking later about drought resilience on your farm. You're farming in these traditional ways. Do you think that you can make a valuable contribution towards feeding the world?
Well, feeding the world is not my responsibility. My responsibility is feeding my own community. And if we as communities acted and bought local and got to know the farmers and respect the farmer, because why is the highest suicide rate in the farming fraternity? Why? Because we're left alone, we're disrespected, we've lost respect for food. You should buy locally, know your farmer, and talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I think, yeah, we've got time for one or two more. So if we have one more from the online conference.
This is a question from Zoe. With the key issue being ownership, fueled by the economic incentive of patenting GE crops, should we, the consumers, be taxed to fund this research and therefore retain ownership?
Ooh. Very challenging question. Liz, what do you think?
Well, we already are taxed to fund this research because many of the GM institutes in the UK receive government funding. The vast majority of government's funding of agricultural research is going in that direction, and that's coming from central taxation. So I think that the missing part of that is our ownership, and I think that is, you know, I hadn't quite sort of seen it in that framing, so thank you to the questioner. That's you know, we have part of that equation and we don't have the bit on the other side. So, you know, maybe that's something we should be pulling to the fore. There has been a lot of discussion, in fact, that started at this very conference several years ago when we were in the building before, that much more of the agricultural research funding needs to go into ecological projects, into farmer-led work, but also, you know, if they're getting the money, then yeah, let's buy those, have those patents back for ourselves, and then dismantle them. I like it.
Yeah, you know, the whole idea of patenting life was pushed by the GM industry. And I remember in the early days when the draft GATT agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, Article 27.73b, which is the one that opens the doors to patenting life. And Monsanto said, we were the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. We defined a problem. The problem was that farmers save seeds. We offered a solution. And the solution was it should be made a crime to save seeds. And we then offered the medicals. The solution was basically have an international law to criminalize seed saving. That's where I started, Navdanya. That's when I started to save seeds. But I think the movement for no patents on life and no patents on seed is the ethical movement of our times. When I started to think about it that time, I said, people used to take slavery as natural, you know. To buy and sell human beings was considered right in those colonial days. And then some people said it's not right. and the abolition movement started. And eventually we got rid of slavery. Now we are talking about a slavery over all life. And we have to say absolutely no to the owning of life, because those who pretend to be the creators of life are not creating it. They're manipulating it. You can't edit. You can't edit a living complex organism. It's a wrong metaphor. You know, the word program, maybe you can cut and paste, not life. It's too complex. And precision in cutting of a fragile web is again another wrong metaphor. So I think our big movement has to be reclaiming seeds as a commons. That's the movement of seed sovereignty, and knowledge as a common good. That is right.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of workshops and stories on seed saving going on later today, so if you're interested, please do go. Did you guys want to add anything?
Well, I guess I just say that I agree that seeds shouldn't be owned. And in the first place, I don't think public money should be put into developing patents to be given or sold to someone, because it should be public property. Seeds can be researched, and maybe a concept like some researchers in the States are doing an open source seed initiative, kind of like open source software, that you can take a seed, research it, study it, but you can't change it, you can't patent it, you can't own it. It's public information. And I think if the public is putting money into research, the product of that should be owned by the public, not given away or sold to a corporation.
All right, one more question. Let's go for fifth row back on this side.
Hi. I was wanting to know, what are your experiences of engaging with people who aren't able to afford to buy organically, buy locally? I'm asking this because I'm privileged enough to be able to buy organic and locally grown food, but my peers at my university aren't necessarily able to do that. And when I do try to talk to them, I sometimes feel like I'm on this high horse of talking about all these issues about GM, and while they're just trying to get through life on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I would just love to hear your thoughts or any advice on how to engage with people on this matter. Yeah.
Thank you. I can actually add a bit to that, if you don't mind. I came to Oxford from a very privileged background as well, used to eating so much good food, and to see students living off of pot noodle was a little bit hard to watch. But then there were some amazing programs started up, such as Ox Co-op, which brought in CSA boxes from outside the city, put them in a central location where students could collect them. They bulk ordered items from Essential so that students could afford the lower prices for organics, and that was really nice to see. I know there was another lady who was interested in setting that up in Edinburgh University. So I found those sort of schemes are really useful, especially for students who don't have much time to do that themselves. What about you guys? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd want to say on that is it's not GM Freeze's mission. I mean, I personally am also part of a buyers co-op locally, so I think there are some roots into that, and there are some people, no doubt, here at the conference doing fantastic work. But the one thing I just want to pick up on there in the context of this session is that it can't be a binary choice between organic and GM. And if we allow that to be part of the discussion, we're feeding what's basically happened in the States, which is that, you know, it's fine, you don't need GM labels because you can always buy organic, because you know, organic doesn't allow GM anywhere in the food chain. Now, firstly, if this genetic technology bill goes through as it currently stands, it will be very difficult to keep GM out of the organic supply chains here. But also, you know, organic is one of the answers. There are other answers that don't have that certification model. There's a great rich diversity of approaches, and we absolutely cannot allow organic to be seen as the opposite of GM. What GM is the opposite of is a good food system, a good and complex food system. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the way to address this apartheid in the nutritional system is to address the falsehood of the fake cheap. Because what's called cheap food is very costly to produce. It's got subsidies at every level. In the agriculture system, $400 billion annually. That's more than $1 billion a day to make high-cost patented GMO seeds produce low-cost food. Isn't it a miracle? And that's your tax money, you know. Half of the tax money of Europe was going to pay for CAP. That's how Europe became an industrial agriculture system. And then doing the true cost accounting, we've done a book on this. $1.3 trillion is the externality in terms of harm to farmers, harm to the soil, harm to cows and other beings. And if you add the health costs of the hyper-processed American diet that is being globalized all over the world, that would be another $2 trillion. So we are talking about a country with 1.5 billion economy. We are now being asked to carry a shadow. And for people, you know, when you engage in your dialogue, I think the most important thing is to talk about the ill health impacts. That when you buy so-called cheap food, you're buying a high-cost medical bill. And that's why you need to see your food as your healer and the farmer as your doctor.
I'm certain, Jim, you have a lot of experience with that. When I moved to the US recently, I was very shocked to be able to buy one hamburger for the same price as one onion. And I know it wasn't healthy, and there people have to pay for their own healthcare a lot of the time. So what have your experiences been with this?
Well, I think that it was explained very well that conventional food has all these externalized costs that aren't counted as part of the price, and that's why it's cheap. I think that any organic farmer in the States knows that the price spread between what he gets paid and what's charged in the grocery store for organic food is much higher than the price spread between conventional food and conventional food in the store. And retailers know this. They say, well, it's organic. We can charge more and we can get away with it. There are times in the States when you can buy locally grown organic heirloom tomatoes in the grocery stores cheaper than you can get the tomatoes that are there all year because they're in season and they're local and they're much better. So I think our whole concept of local food, cheap food, organic food is being skewed by the supermarkets and the retailers to make a profit. The biggest problem is that, you know, and I think Liz said it before, people aren't stupid about making food choices. If they're making bad choices, in many cases, it's because they're poor. You know, people in inner cities buy calories because they need to buy calories to stay alive, and that's usually highly processed, highly sugared foods. In the United States, we can't even get our government to pass a living wage for people. Minimum wage is still around $7 an hour. That's not enough to buy food, let alone a place to live. So I think the real problem is that people aren't paid enough. And if people are paid a fair living wage, whether they're a cab driver, a school teacher, whatever, they are allowed, they have the ability to make better choices. And generally, better food choices is going to be one of them.
All right, Gerald, quickly back to the question then. How do we engage people? How do we bring it so that everyone can have access to healthy, affordable food?
Well, we've created a CSA on the farm about 10 years ago. It's one of the best things we've done. I know more of my local people now than ever before because they come to the farm for the food and they have a veg box every week. And we live in a now society. We want everything now. We want Christmas with one touch on our mobile phone. Instead, we should value food and the adventure of pursuit of the right food for your own health. Because we used to be hunters, and now we sit on our, on our chairs with a mobile phone. Food is a quest, and food, it should be respected, the right food. And like I said, you know, us creating our, for me, we're doing the right thing. We're feeding our community, and the community are coming to us for the vegetables. That gives me pride that they want to come and get our food, and that is really prime. And it should, that's what we all should do. Don't go to the supermarket. Go to buy local. What really upset me over the pandemic, when the shelves in the supermarket were going empty, people were panicking. Nobody was asking how the farmer is. Just the shelf was going empty.
All right, we're out of time. I guess you guys have the rest of the conference to figure out how we can get access to healthy, affordable food, though. That's our goal. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Jim Goodman, Gerald Miles, Vandana Shiva, and Liz O'Neill.